All right. Good day, everybody. This is Matt Webb with UT Extension, Marshall County. Thank you once again for joining us for the lunch series. Got a nice one for you today. We got Les Humble, who is our area farm management specialist for the University of Tennessee Extension. He's going to be talking today about management principles for forest land. So, Les, thank you for being with us. Looking forward to what you have to share with us today.
Okay, thank you, Matt. As Matt mentioned, my name is Les Humble, and I work with UT Extension. I'm based in Murray County, but I do serve a 10-county area, which includes Williamson County, Marshall County, over to Decatur, and also the three bottom counties there in Tennessee, which would be Giles, Lawrence, and Wayne County. Today, we're going to be talking about the management principles of forest land, and not so much about how to start a forest or how to improve it as far as it stands, but mainly about the management aspect of it in general. Oftentimes, when you're dealing with forest land or timberland, it's something that people don't deal with on a regular basis as they would with maybe a traditional row crops or livestock. It's not managed with the same intensity or interest as other land. And with that, many owners kind of lack that experience in forest land management and marketing. It's one thing with forest land, oftentimes it kind of gets put in the back of the mind, just the length of time that it takes to grow a marketable timber. And whether you own forest land as an investment or as a hobby or just to enjoy it, that's great. But again, it should be something that should be on your radar as far as how to best management, not only environmentally, but also economically. Later on, we'll talk about basis as far as on value of a timber stand, and a little bit about, if you're doing a succession plan or transferring to the next generation, some of the things that we need to kind of keep in mind. Another thing that's difficult with the marketing data is not really readily available for timber or timber products as it would be with a normal commodity crop like corn or soybeans or cattle, where you kind of go on almost any website, market report, and have that data immediately. Timber is a little bit more difficult to get prices on and determine the value. One thing I wanted to kind of do is just kind of give a broad kind of overview of the economic impact timberland or forest management has on the state of Tennessee, and also the amount of timber that is available. This first graph here, it's a little bit older data. It goes back to 2012, but it covers years from 1961 up to 2012 as far as timberland. Oftentimes, we'll hear about things like how trees are being cut down and lost. We don't have that forest that we used to back in the old days, so to speak. But when we look at it, dating back to 1961, we can see in Tennessee we had 13.7 million acres of forest land. Fast forward up to 2012, we can see that we're at 13.9 million acres. So over that course of roughly 50 years, we've actually increased the area of forest land that we do have in the state. Based on that, forest land covers over 52% of the land volume here in the state, which is a total of about 27 million acres. So again, we've been steady, maintain that number of acres over that course of 50 years. Looking at the last census data from 2017, we can see that we have decreased about 40,000 acres of forest land in Tennessee. Now with that, we look a little bit further at the data, which show that actually the number of trees that are on the forested land has actually increased by about 400 million trees. And also the volume of those live trees, the size, the growth size has greatly increased based on that billion cubic feet. You can see that the increase in volume of live trees has increased somewhere around about 3 billion cubic feet. And kind of what that tells us also is that our forest lands are maturing, and as they mature, just like with any other living, breathing creature, it does have a timeline, a lifespan. So those that own forest land or timber, kind of keep in mind that if you want to salvage some value, you want to make sure that those trees are still in good health, in value, when they're harvested and not let go to decay. So when we look at some of the forest land ownership in the state, we can see that of that 13.9 million acres, that 84% of that forest land is privately held. Now, when we talk about that privately held, that not only includes farmers, landowners, but also some of the private industries, the paper companies or the timber companies also own some of that as well. The rest of it is made up from federal land, about 10%, and then the state or local governments have about 6% of that land volume as well, of forest land. So just a simple graph here, we can kind of see that about 84% is private ownership, 10% federal, and then about 7% would be the local and state levels. So what kind of makes up the majority of the species in Tennessee? And with that, the majority is going to be those hardwoods. It's going to be the white oak, the red oak, hickory, poplar, maple. Hickory and oak in itself make up about 9.9 million acres. Now, we also have some softwood like the lobby pine, Virginia pine, some red cedars, and some of the other shortleaf pine that will kind of, made up and is kind of, I wouldn't say controlled, but managed mainly by a lot of the paper mill companies or the pulpwood industry. And again, with the hardwood, that's going to be made into timbers, cross ties, those type of products. So we kind of break that down in some of the different tree or species groups that we have. Again, out of that 72% here would be that oak and hickory group, and then that other remaining 28% is made up of a lot of the maple, birch, some of the elm, ash, and the pines, and some of the other exotic hardwoods and other hardwood group types. The production, the trees that are harvested that go into production on a statewide basis, most of that's going to be the saw logs. The one that's going to be used for staves, cross ties. It's going to be for building materials, and also moved into manufacturing as well, furnitures and the like. Also some of the higher grade lumber, it gets shipped overseas. China, Europe are also buyers of the quality wood products. When we kind of look at the production side, the value side, trees in general, the species, what makes one log worth more than the other? Again, quality. It comes down to quality. So that's why it's kind of difficult on just a regular basis to determine, what kind of value you have in your woods. What can you do with it? Is it economical to log it in a sense? So when we look at, the economic impact that the forestry and agriculture industry has on Tennessee, it is quite considerable. Now, this is from the Implan group of UT Knoxville. I put this information together. And when we look at the numbers, the red at the top, it's the total economy of the state of Tennessee. That's 648,000. That represents multiplied by million. So actually, you're looking at $648 billion total state economy. Now, that's not just from sales, but it also has everything that relates to a sale or output. Of that, 3.7% is forest, which would be about $24 billion. that is would be the total economic output for the state. And the other remaining 8% of the state economy would be agriculture related industry. So as just looking at this, we can see in general around $81 billion is the economic impact that agriculture and forestry has on the state economy. So we look at it, forestry in itself makes up about 3.5% of the state economy and employs around close to 100,000 Tennesseans. Now that's either in the people that are doing the loggers, sawmill operators. It goes on a little bit further as far as those other outliers, manufacturers, paper industry, the truck drivers, all encompass it. So again, it generates about $24 billion in total output. When we look at the annual saw timber removals, Tennessee generates about 1.4 billion board feet of lumber a year. And of that, about 87% of that is removed from private landowners. So this is kind of why we want to make sure that when I sit down with landowners, to make them aware of the value of their lumber and also what can be done to better manage it long term. Another kind of analysis here, as far as when we kind of add in some of these indirect effects, direct effects, induced effect, this is when we really look at how far-reaching the impact it does have on the state of Tennessee. So when we look at some of these numbers here and some of these definitions for just the sawmills in general, the indirect effects, that's the kind of will encompass the business aspect of it. So we look at the wholesale trade, the commercial logging business, the back and forth between those industries and the dollars that it generates in shares. The direct effect, that's going to be more regulated to the results of the money that's initially spent within that industry, whether it's going to be for salaries or supplies, raw materials, operating expenses. You'll see that's about $837 million. And the one term that many probably aren't familiar with, but the induced effects. And that's related to the increase in incomes of those involved with the industry. And with that increased incomes, the money that is spent in the local economy for real estate, for housing, hospital expenses, and just general wholesale trade in total. So you can see the far-reaching effects that the sawmill industry has within the state. When we look a little bit at the commercial logging business, now it's not going to have quite those numbers as the sawmill has, mainly because it's not having that many steps in that process. You're talking about harvesting timber from the land. So we're looking at, again, those direct expenses that's related to that. And then the indirect, again, is that business activity, the transportation, the purchasing of products and timber tracts all kind of add in with it as well. And again, the induced effects, which relate to, again, that added income from employees and being spent throughout the community. Excuse me there. Looking at the availability of when you do have that product, where can you take it? When we look at the sawmills that we have throughout the state, Tennessee here is going to be represented by these dark blue dots. We go back to 1955, there was around 1,300 sawmills. And I've seen a study recently that said after World War II, there was over 2,400 operating sawmills in the state. Now currently, we're around probably about 320 sawmills. Even though they're spread out further, the efficiency of the new equipment, the modernization, easily makes up for those loss in numbers with the efficiency of the individual sawmills that we have here in the state. wanted to kind of go over some terms that we'll be using here today, and we want to look at one of the main things that we kind of talk about when we talk about value is stumpage, and that term, it's used to determine the value of available timber. The stumpage can be valued either on a tonnage basis or on a 1,000 board foot. A 1 board feet is measured by 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch. Now, the value of the timber, this is the value of the timber to the landowner. So when we talk about stumpage, it's not the price that you would receive at the mill. So basically, if you had someone come onto your land to harvest timber, you would be receiving the price that's offered at the mill. You would have to factor in their expenses of retrieving that lumber, moving the equipment, and hauling expenses. So again, when you go about and truly find the value of the timber on your land, a lot of factors have to be taken into consideration. The species of the tree, the size of the tree, the quality of it. You can have one oak tree that be quite prized for veneer for veneer lumber, which would be worth maybe a few $1,000s, or if it's just an average oak tree that would be just used for maybe some cross ties, some lumber, it'd be worth much less. Other factors into consideration when they value timber or timber acreage is also the volume per acre and the number of acres that you do have. Hauling that big equipment into an area to log is quite expensive. So if you have just a few acres, it may not be worth their time to come out to your land to do logging. There are some smaller companies that probably will. The larger companies, they're going to be looking for more acreage where they can spend more time, make their operation more efficient. Other factors can consider, the distance to that sawmill, how long you'd be running it back and forth for those trucks, and then the market for finished products. Lumber is a commodity. The building trades, when we have a really booming building trades or housing, the value of that lumber will increase. Foreign markets, the increased usage, from a country like China will help increase the value of those quality hardwoods. Now, if they back off of their buying or their economies are suffering, so will the economies here and the value of our lumber here as well. Supply changes, you can't make rapid supply changes when the market fluctuates. So it's basically, that value at that particular time is going to be dictated. When you look at over time, I'm going to show you a graph here as far as how the movement of prices. This is from the Timber Market South. It's a publication that can be signed up for. You can get some really basic information free online. If you want to submit or sign up, you can get more detailed information. Now, this one is from 2016. I wanted to kind of just go over it. It goes back, 10 years just as a state, South and Southeast U.S., kind of the average price for stumpage. And the first one here, when we look at some of that hardwood saw timber. So we go back to 2005, it was running about $20 a ton. And then up to fourth quarter of 15, it moved up to about $30 a ton. We look at the current marketing situation here in the Southeast. We kind of look at that mixed hardwood saw timber. Currently that price is around $30 a ton. That would be what would be kind of on average paid to the landowner. It is up about $9 from 10 years ago. So that market has held steady, as you can kind of see here, increasingly somewhat over the years. So another kind of definition we want to kind of we hear a lot about is sawmills. And some of them in the past would buy by the board foot. Others are kind of transitioning or from time to time by the tons. So there's two different methods that are kind of mainly used. They both can be implemented by that sawmill and in the pricing scenario. But how do you convert tonnage to board feet? So here, on average, approximately 8 tons of lumber or of wood will equal 1,000 board feet. So how do you kind of convert that from tonnage price to the value that you would put on a board foot? So what we do, we kind of use a multiplier effect of tonnage. We multiply that by 0.008. So if you're at a sawmill and they say the price is $65 a ton, what you would do is just multiply that by 0.008 and you get 52 cents per board foot. Multiply by 1,000 and you have $520 per 1,000 board foot. I'm going to kind of show you how that kind of works here. The prices I have are from the same operation, but the price per 1,000 board foot was from 4 years ago. So you can kind of see some of the prime oak was running around $1,000 per 1,000 board foot. If they're buying logs, the second grade is all the way down to 300. So you can see there's a big movement within that price zone. So if we currently, that same sawmill is purchasing hardwood on a rough basis of $65 a ton. So kind of based on that, at $65 a ton, 1,000 board foot would be around $520. So again, just kind of getting in perspective, using those multiplier effects, would kind of give that whole landowner a better idea of kind of where that falls in their value. Again, that's going to be the value at the sawmill and not the stumpage price. You almost have to take kind of rule of thumb, kind of about half. So, some of the harvesting strategies to keep in mind, you can either do select cutting, which would be just taking out the trees that have that best marketable value, mature trees. Some of the cons to that if you have an area where you have these select trees, the trees that are below that tree line, so to speak, they've already branched out. So if you remove those mature trees, those select trees, and just leave what's left to regenerate, those trees will not be growing much more. They're not going to really increase that volume. So it might be better off in some cases to do some select cutting, or section cutting, which would be just taking an area, taking all the trees off, and then working on a reestablishment plan. Clear cutting is another option, which is just where, just like it sounds, everything comes off. So what's the best for your land for the value? It's hard to say. That's where really the work comes into play as far as the management part of it, managing those resources. There's resources out there to help you with that. State resources, whether it's from state foresters or extension or private foresters. There are industries out there that can help you manage your lumber resources. The first one we'll kind of talk about is the Tennessee State Foresters. Now that's a division of the USDA and the Tennessee Forestry Division. So this is a government agency. They work in the area of forest management. They help, put the plans together for landowners. From time to time, they'll have different conservation cost share programs, where it could be establishing new forest, some burn downs, forest improvements, in general, forestry questions that you may have. They can also help in, determining what the value is, the feasibility of harvesting a timber stand. Now, one thing to remember is that they are a government agency, so they cannot be involved with any type of marketing or timber transactions. With that, you would have to utilize a private forester. but more resources can be available at the website here in blue if you want to explore that a little bit more. Here's a map of area foresters across the state of Tennessee. Typically, each one will cover maybe 3 or 4 counties in an area. So this map is helpful as far as if you're working with for your own utilization, or if you're working with a neighbor or landowner in finding out who those foresters are, that can kind of help with those general questions to get started. Second, there's also what they call consulting foresters. Now this is going to be, these are private foresters that they either work for a company or they work individually, and they have the responsibility of kind of managing land for both the current and future generations. They have a number of different services to the landowners, and it's done on a fee or on contract basis. Oftentimes, if you're working with a consulting forester on marketing timber, there's going to be a percentage that they take, much like, say, a realtor. Now, what they can do, they can access your land. They can do what they kind of call a timber cruise, determining the value of the timber that you have on your property. They can put a plan together to sell that lumber and work with sawmills or logging companies to get the best price for that landowner. So again, it's a private foresters. They don't work for the state. They work for the landowners in general. And through the website, there's a directory of current consulting foresters. Also, there's another type of foresters called industrial foresters. Typically, these are going to be employed by the forest industries, the paper company, the lumber companies. So they manage not only the company land, but they also will buy lumber as well, or wood. So these are going to be kind of those professionals that the consulting forester is going to work in with. Now, from time to time, these forest industries, if they're harvesting lumber off you or timber off your land, they may have some incentives such as free tree seedlings for each forestrations. So again, another resource out there for the landowner. And the last one I'm going to kind of cover here, besides the work that we do with Extension, is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of the USDA. They can provide, through some of their different programs, cost share programs for establishing timber stands and managing timberland through some of their EQIP programs. Some of the other resources they have through their website, they have some spreadsheets, Excel spreadsheets that are really outstanding to work with as far as looking at the economics of timber stand management. Another resource they had, I found was very helpful, was a spreadsheet called The Economics of Converting Existing Forest Land to Pasture Land, taking in consideration the value of the stand that you have, what it costs to remove those stumps, reseeding, which can get extremely expensive to do. And when you really look at the total return on investment, it's trying to convert a forest land to pasture. In most cases, it really doesn't pencil out. However, if those are your plans to convert some of that forest land to pasture, some of those sales of timber could help with that as well. So again, another great resource to utilize is the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So before you go about, or a landowner goes about selling timber, the best thing to do is really, start with a goal. Start with a plan that you have in mind. Whether you want to improve that stand just for future generation and just for enjoyment, for recreational use, or if you wanted to do it as an investment, improve that investment over time as far as with the quality of lumber you have. Start with that plan. So, again, the plans are they're a guide for you over time. You implement those plans in phases over time. And also it helps, provide that record of activities, what was done, when were trees planted or thinned, those type of things. You know, you can have plans that have detailed short-term recommendations, and also others will be more long-term recommendations. But again, you know, it provides that continuity over time, just like you would with any type of business plan. Working with a trained forester, I can see with a consulting forester or someone with an extension, we have some great resources in Dr. David Merker in West Tennessee that would be glad to help work with individuals to better assess what they have and what can be done. A great publication that I use is also from Dr. Merker. It's called Forest Systems publication that can be accessed online. So this is kind of the second step as far as, you know, oftentimes when you do have a timber property, it's not like a row crop where you have maybe fence lines or boundary that is looked after on a regular basis. Some of these boundaries can get difficult to define. So again, you know, before anything is done on a property, you want to make sure that you have designated property lines. You can work with a forester. Now, if those boundary lines are kind of difficult or are not understood right, working with that adjoining landowner and agreeing on those properties is a must. If boundaries can't really be determined, it may be you call for surveys. Now, a survey of land is not cheap, but it may be necessary, you know, before any type of work or management practices, whether it be logging, starts. You know, have that timber appraised before harvest. And that's where, you know, when we talked about those consulting foresters could come in and do what is called a timber cruise, where they come through and estimate the number of trees, the species of trees, and also the volume and the value that be harvested. You know, from that timber cruise, the landowner then would have a summary of what's on their land and how to better manage that forest stand that you do have. Whether, again, you want to sell any of it or if you want to improve that stand for future generations. You know, soliciting bids and preparing a contract. You know, from that timber summary, when you're working with a consulting forester, they'll look at the value of the standing trees and also the stumpage value as well. We talked earlier about what stumpage meant as far as what the value is to that particular landowner. By having that appraisal, about having those that package put together, a consulting forester can then prepare a sales prospectus. Now that will include the trees that are on, the volume of the trees, and also any details that the landowner may want to have as far as the type of practices used in the clearing, you know, the roads that can be put in by the logger, how the land is to be left after they're done, will all affect the bid price from logging companies. Now, you know, one thing with working with a consulting forester, they're going to have those resources where they've worked with many different logging companies in the past. They're able to spread that reach out further to, again, increase the number of potential bidders on that land and hopefully the price as well. Another thing to keep in mind as far as when you are working with any type of logging company, you need to have a contract. According to Tennessee laws, selling lumber without or timber without a contract is illegal. That contract, you know, not protects the landowner and also the timber firm that has that winning bid. So it's going to be stipulated, you know, what trees can be removed, you know, the way that the land has to be reclaimed or unreclaimed within that contract. So both parties will be fully informed about the process going forward. You know, planning for that next phase of Forestland. Again, you know, what happens in the future? It's timber marketing and management is a process. It takes a lot of requirements for a successful future crop. So initiating those activities immediate following harvest. So, what we kind of want to look at as far as when you're managing it, you want to look long-term. So if you do remove any trees, what's going to be the next step in the process? So initiating a lot of these activities as soon as harvest is done, you're able to maybe use some of those proceeds, revenue from the timber sale, to reinvest. Secondly, when that land is kind of clear after a harvest, it'll be much easier to reestablish. You don't have that overgrowth. You may still have some of the timber roads and trails that can be better utilized as well. And also, when you do use some of those proceeds right after harvest to reinvest, there's tax advantages as well. So reinvestment tax advantages that you will have for that landowner. Timber tax management, it can be quite difficult. There's a lot of different steps involved for it, but it's something that really should be done even if you don't plan on selling. You want to start with the tax management as early in the process as possible. A great resource is timbertax.org, which is a great resource for learning more about the steps that needed to take. Because a forest plan really needs to be kind of incorporated into the full context of your financial plan. And again, when you're utilizing tax professionals, make sure that they understand timber tax management. It's different than the ordinary tax accounting that you may have. And if mistakes are made today, they can really have profound effects later on. So there's three kind of main classifications of timber property. There's going to be that investment property, used again mainly for growing assets over time, the appreciation over time of that property. Someone buys it with the intent of buying maybe a young stand, immature stand, knowing further down the road as it matures, that asset increases. That's kind of one classification. Another is just that personal use property. Again, that's for mainly a lot of our landowners that I do work with. It's mainly just for that enjoyment versus profit. However, from time to time, there'll be expenses involved with that property as well. And long term, if it's personal property, that's woodland. If there's a transfer to the next generation or inherited, there's things you need to kind of keep in mind as far as managing the basis to reduce tax effects later on. The third is going to be the business property. That's going to be more for those that are in the industry, that are buying on a regular basis, that are managing, selling, purchasing more on a timely basis. Much like if you had a farm business, if you're full-time farming or really active farm, that's going to be more of that business property in a sense. If you have a business, you need to kind of, if you manage it as a business, it has to be materially participate in that business for losses to be deducted on a taxes basis. So if the objective is not met, your timber activities may be considered a hobby rather than a business. And if it's be considered a hobby, oftentimes some of those losses or costs cannot be deducted as for a hobby as they would be for business. So one thing I kind of wanted to kind of go over and just showing how the tax implications can take effect as far as timber value and the importance of finding the basis. For instance, if you inherit timber property, usually the transaction is just on a land basis. So if land values is $2,000, it's kind of just thought of as $2,000. But if that timber value has a value, you want to make sure that is recorded at that date of that transfer. For instance, in this scenario, if you purchase the timber tract for $72,000 and the appraised timber value of that is $32,000, that leaves that $40,000 for just the land value. So your basis in the timber is $32,000. So if you had a timber sale later on and you sold $70,000 of the timber, that base of 32 would be subtracted. So you'd have a taxable gain or capital gains of $38,000. Now that can be taxed at a lower tax bracket of 20%. Also, you don't have to pay self-employment tax on capital gains. So you're looking at tax rate from that timber sale of $7,600. Now, if there was no basis factored into a timber sale of $70,000, that full amount would be taxable. So at that 20% rate, it'd be $14,000. So you can see there's about almost a $7,000 difference between that. So establishing that basis is extremely important for not only tax purposes, but also for management purposes later on. So kind of in conclusion, for most forest land owners, marketing timber, it happens just so infrequently. You only talk about maybe once or twice in a lifetime. So being proficient at it in that whole process is kind of rarely achieved. So that's why working with professional foresters, extension personnel, developing that forest land management plan is so important in the long term. It's about the future. It's not really about what's kind of happening today, but what is that future? By managing that forest land, hopefully will increase the current and future timber revenue, but also will help protect that environmental resources for future generations. So with that, I also included some additional information on some of these links that will be a great resource. Many of these are UT publications. Some are from the Forestry Association that can also be utilized. I want to kind of point out I'm an area specialist in the farm management part of UT Extension. The counties I serve are in yellow, and then I have 8 counterparts across the state, which would be more than glad to work with individual landowners as far as working on a timber management plan or other aspect of the agriculture industry. So I have my contact information here. I'd be glad to please reach out if you have any questions, and I'm glad to work with you further on. So at this time, that's all that I have. So I don't know if there's any questions. I'm glad to answer them for you.
Excellent job, Les. I think this is a real handy presentation, particularly for your people who are new to owning or managing forest land. So I do appreciate you doing this for us today. We don't have any questions in the chat box. If there's anybody that has a question, be sure to unmute yourself and give Les your questions.